In 2011, National Defense magazine published the account of an American vehicle commander named Samsel, and the detail that made the story worth telling was not the explosion. It was what happened afterward. Across 3 deployments, this was the 14th improvised explosive device to go off underneath him. 14. And this time, he was riding inside the vehicle the United States had spent tens of billions of dollars to build precisely for this second. The vehicle designed from the ground up around a single question, which was, how do you keep a man alive when the road itself detonates? The hull did its job. The blast went out and around instead of up and through. Everyone inside survived, and then the doors would not open. The M-ATV used a pneumatic door system, air pressure to swing several hundred pounds of armored steel. The tanks that held that air, he said afterward, were not protected in any way, and the explosion had destroyed them. So the men sat sealed inside the most survivable ground vehicle in the American inventory, protected from everything except the vehicle itself, waiting to be cut out. Hold that image. A sealed door on a vehicle that just saved your life. Because that is the whole story of the mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicle in one frame. And it is the reason this program is still argued about almost 20 years later. This was the fastest major wartime acquisition in modern Pentagon history. Roughly $45 to $48 billion, depending on how you count. Nearly 28,000 vehicles built. Around 24,000 fielded. The Secretary of Defense personally forced it through against, by his own account, the objections of every senior official who mattered. And the Pentagon would eventually claim that it saved as many as 40,000 lives. Then a team of economists went into the classified casualty data and said in print, in Foreign Affairs, that the heaviest vehicles did not save more lives than the medium ones did, at 3 times the price. Both of those things cannot be true. So which one is? Did the M-ATV earn the money, or did it just look like it did? Start with the promise, because the promise was enormous and it came from a very specific kind of desperation. In the years of the Iraq War, the improvised explosive device was not one weapon among many. It was the war. In testimony to the House Armed Services Committee in October of 2009, the Government Accountability Office told Congress that as of July 2008, roughly 75% of casualties in combat operations in Iraq and Afghanistan were attributed to IEDs, 3 out of every 4. Not tank battles, not ambushes, not aircraft. Buried charges under a road that a truck had to drive down anyway. And what America was driving down those roads was the Humvee, a vehicle designed in the 1980s as a fast, light, go-anywhere replacement for the Jeep, with a flat steel floor 18 inches off the ground. Crews bolted armor plate onto the sides. They sandbagged the floors. They welded scrap metal in improvised kits that soldiers themselves nicknamed hillbilly armor. None of it addressed the actual physics of the problem, because the problem was not coming from the side. It was coming from directly underneath. So the promise of the M-ATV was simple enough to fit on a slide, and radical enough to reorganize an entire defense industry. A vehicle that would not just resist a blast but redirect it. A vehicle so tall and so heavy and so strangely shaped that the explosion would slide off it. Troops started calling them steel cocoons. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates would later say they proved to be 10 times safer than the Humvee. Whole convoys, whole missions, whole tours were rebuilt around the idea that the road could no longer kill you. That is a very large promise. Here is how the machine was supposed to keep it. The core idea is not American, and that is worth saying plainly at the start, because the American version of this story usually skips it. The V-shaped hull came out of southern Africa. It was developed through the bush wars of the 1970s in vehicles like the Rhodesian Leopard, and it matured in apartheid-era South Africa in the Buffalo, and above all in the Caspier, whose first prototype appeared in 1979. The Caspier is widely considered the first true mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicle in the modern sense. A V-bottomed monocoque hull certified to survive a triple anti-tank mine detonation under a wheel. Something on the order of 21 kilograms of high explosive. The Americans did not invent this. They bought into a lineage. The Cougar, built by Force Protection Incorporated, descended through that lineage by way of the Denell-Mecum Lion family. The Buffalo grew out of the Lion too. The Cougar grew out of the 4x4 Lion. Force Protection took over the product line in 2005. So what does the V actually do? Think about what a blast is. An explosive charge under a vehicle produces a pressure wave and a jet of gas and dirt moving upward at enormous speed. If the bottom of your vehicle is a flat plate, That plate sits perpendicular to the wave. It catches the full force square on, like a hand slapping down on water. And every bit of that energy transfers straight up through the floor, into the seats and the boots and the spines of the people sitting on it. Now, tilt the plate. Make the bottom of the vehicle a shallow V, a keel like an upside-down boat hull. The wave no longer hits a flat face. It hits an angled one, and it does what any force hitting an angled surface does. It deflects. The energy splits and travels outward and upward along the two sides of the hull, instead of punching through the middle of it. Add the second factor, which is height. Raise that hull well above the ground, and you give the pressure wave room to expand and weaken before it ever arrives. Add the third factor, which is mass. Make the whole thing heavy enough that it resists being thrown. Together, those three choices, angle, height, and weight, are the entire concept. There is a bonus too. Sloped armor is better armor against direct fire because a projectile arriving at an angle has to chew through more effective thickness of steel to get inside. It is elegant. It works. And it comes with a bill that the physics will not let you refuse, because a vehicle with a high hull, a raised body, and enormous mass is, by definition, a vehicle with a very high center of gravity. You have built something that is superb at absorbing a hit from below and dangerously unstable when it is asked to turn sharply, or to drive on a soft shoulder, or to sit at an angle on a crumbling bank. Brigadier General Michael Brogan, who managed the Marine Corps M-ATV program, put it to the Associated Press about as honestly as a program manager ever puts anything. "What you give up when you raise the hull," he said, "is the sure-footedness that comes from a low center of gravity." That trade was not a mistake, and it was not hidden. It was the deal. Engineers made it on purpose because underbelly blasts were killing people, and rollovers at that point were not. Remember that sentence. We are coming back to it. The family that came out of this idea was never one vehicle, and that matters for anyone trying to read the record. The Cougar, in 4-wheel and 6-wheel versions, was the springboard, around 14.5 tons, with a base cost somewhere in the range of $475,000 to $560,000. The British bought into the same hull and up-armored it into the Mastiff, then built out a small menagerie around it, the Wolfhound, the Ridgeback, the St. Bernard, and one British instructor became well enough known for teaching men to drive the thing that he was simply called Mr. Mastiff. The Buffalo was the giant of the family, a 6-wheeled monster with a mine-clearing arm on the front. The Cayman from BAE Systems ran around 19 tons. The Max Pro from Navistar became the most ordered variant and the Army's workhorse, with a V-hull bolted onto a commercial international truck chassis, rather than welded as a single piece. The RG-31 was the small one, roughly 9 tons, and it became the favorite in Afghanistan because it could actually get places. That is the machine. Now the part that decides everything, which is what happened when the machines met the roads. The story that changed American defense policy came out of Anbar province in the spring of 2007. USA Today ran a piece on the 19th of April under a headline about new vehicles protecting Marines across 300 attacks. Brigadier General John Allen, then Deputy Commander of Coalition Forces in Anbar, gave the number that stopped the argument cold. Across attacks on these vehicles, he said, the average was fewer than 1 injured Marine per attack. Across the same period, there had been around 1,100 attacks on coalition vehicles in the province, and attacks on the other vehicles were producing more than 2 casualties apiece, including deaths. Fewer than 1 injury per attack, against more than 2 casualties per attack. And at that point, the Marines in Anbar had roughly 100 of these things. They wanted 3,000 more. Sit with what that meant in the spring of 2007, when 35 of the 60 American combat deaths in a single month came from IEDs, and at least 16 of those men had been riding in Humvees. A field commander was telling the country in a newspaper, with numbers, that there was a vehicle that could take the war's signature weapon and give it back almost nothing. On the 8th of May 2007, Robert Gates declared the MRAP the Department of Defense's highest priority acquisition program. That is not a figure of speech. It is a formal designation, and he backed it with the Defense Production Act, invoking the DX rating, the mechanism that lets the government jump to the front of an industrial queue and compel suppliers to serve it first. He needed that because at the time the United States had exactly 2 mills producing armor-quality steel. 2. The most powerful military on Earth wanted to build tens of thousands of armored trucks in 18 months, and the raw material came from 2 buildings. In his memoir, Gates wrote something that ought to be read alongside every complaint about the cost of this program. Not one senior official, civilian or military, supported his proposal for a crash program. Not one. He did it anyway. Production ran from 82 vehicles a month toward numbers nobody in the building thought were achievable. And by 2009, the Government Accountability Office was reporting more than 16,000 built and nearly 14,000 fielded across 2 theaters. If you are the kind of viewer who wants the actual combat record and the actual receipts instead of the recruiting poster version of a program, subscribe. This next part is where the story turns. Now back to the road. Because the record was never clean, and the honest version says so early. The first American killed by an IED while in an M-ATV died in January of 2008. A turret gunner, later identified as a soldier from the 1st Battalion, 30th Infantry of the 3rd Infantry Division. Even that death is complicated in a way that tells you something true about the vehicle. It was unclear whether the blast killed him or the rollover that followed it did. And the 3 men sitting inside the hull survived with minor injuries. The capsule worked. The man exposed above it did not have a capsule. By April of 2008, Stars and Stripes was reporting 4 MRAP occupant deaths in that month alone, 2 of them from an explosively formed penetrator. That distinction matters. An EFP is not a pile of artillery shells in a culvert. It is a shaped charge, a machined copper plate that the explosion turns into a molten slug, moving fast enough to punch a clean hole through armor. Against the wide, dispersed pressure wave of a conventional buried bomb, the V-hull is close to a perfect answer. Against a focused metal jet, geometry stops helping. You cannot deflect what arrives as a single point, and still, over and over, the thing did what it was built to do. In May of 2010, near Marya in Helmand Province, a Navy corpsman working with the 3rd Battalion, 6th Marines was riding in an M-ATV when a remotely detonated charge went off underneath it. His account, published by Naval Air Systems Command, is all sensory and no drama, which is what makes it land. Dust at his feet, ring ears, dust everywhere. Then he looked over and saw his gunner's legs hanging out of the turret, and he grabbed the man's boot to keep him from going out through the top. Everyone lived. That M-ATV he was riding in existed because of a failure, and the failure is instructive. The Cougar-based MRAPs had been designed for Iraq, which meant designed for roads. Afghanistan does not have roads in that sense. It has mountains, wadis, unpaved tracks, and bridges that were never engineered for a 20-ton truck. In Afghanistan, the MRAP's weight and its poor off-road mobility stopped being an acceptable trade and started being a mission killer. A vehicle that cannot leave the highway in a country with no highways is a vehicle that tells the enemy exactly where you will be. So, in the summer of 2008, the Pentagon went looking for a lighter all-terrain version, and in March of 2009, Oshkosh Defense beat out competitors including BAE and Navistar to win the MRAP all-terrain vehicle contract, largely on the strength of its independent suspension and its truck chassis. The Government Accountability Office put the M-ATV program at an estimated $12.5 billion on its own. Deliveries into Afghanistan began in October of 2009, and Oshkosh ran ahead of schedule. By late August of 2010, nearly 7,500 had been delivered and more than 4,000 were in the field. Each service ended up with a favorite, which is its own quiet commentary on how differently these vehicles behaved. The Marines and the Navy leaned on the Cougar. The Army standardized largely on the Max Pro. Special Operations Command and the Air Force preferred the RG-33. And the smaller, nimbler RG-31 dominated in Afghanistan for the obvious reason that it could turn around on a mountain track. It rode in Anbar. It rode in Diyala. It rode in Helmand and Kandahar, and every place in between where somebody had to drive down a road that somebody else had already visited with a shovel. And for the specific thing it was designed to defeat, it worked. Now, the reckoning. And the reckoning has 3 parts because the case against this program is not one case, it is 3, and they are not equally strong. The first is the number. In June of 2011, USA Today's Tom Vanden Broek reported that the Joint Program Office for MRAP estimated as many as 40,000 lives had been saved, 10,000 in Iraq, and 30,000 in Afghanistan. That figure has been repeated ever since, as though it were a measurement. It is not. The Joint Program Office built the estimate from the number of attacks and the number of troops inside the vehicles, and then said the details of the methodology were classified, which means it cannot be checked by design by anyone outside the building. Notice who did not use it. Gates himself declined to give a number at all. He said thousands and thousands of lives had been saved, and multiples of that in limbs, and left it there. Michael O'Hanlon at Brookings said flatly that 40,000 seemed high, and then added the line that actually frames the whole debate. Even if the true figure were 3,000, he said, it was clearly worth it. The second part of the reckoning is the one that got the program its worst nickname. In 2012, Chris Rolfs, an economist at Syracuse, and Ryan Sullivan, an economist at the Naval Postgraduate School, published a piece in Foreign Affairs called the M-ATV boondoggle. They had worked with restricted Pentagon casualty data, and their finding was specific. For infantry units, they wrote, 1 life was saved for every 7 medium protection vehicles purchased, at something like $1 to $2 million per life saved. But the heavy vehicles, the M-ATVs, did not save more lives than the medium armored ones did, despite costing around 3 times as much. Their sharpest objection was to the Joint Program Office's method itself. To reach 40,000, you have to assume that every occupant of every attacked MRAP would have died in a Humvee, every single one. They called that assumption unreasonable, and on its face it is difficult to defend. That would be a devastating conclusion if it had gone unanswered. It did not. Christopher Lamb and Sally Scudder, writing from the National Defense University, responded in the same magazine with a piece arguing that the MRAP was worth the money. Their objections were methodological and they were not trivial. They argued the sample Rolfs and Sullivan drew from covered a period of relative calm rather than the worst of the fighting. They argued that counting only deaths ignores the wounded, which for a weapon that specialized in amputations is not a small omission. And they brought their own numbers. Congressional data from 2007 had early MRAPs performing up to 400% better than up-armored Humvees at reducing injuries and deaths. A 2008 comparison of combined killed and injured rates put the MRAP at 6%, against 15% for the M1 Abrams tank and 22% for the up-armored Humvee, 6% against 22%. Read that next to did not save more lives than medium vehicles, and you understand why this argument never ended. Both sets of authors are serious. Both are working from partial data. Neither has been settled by a peer-reviewed reanalysis that closes the question. Anyone who tells you the MRAP was definitively a boondoggle or definitively saved 40,000 people is telling you which article they read. If you drove one, maintained one, pulled a door off one, or sat in the back of one when it went up, put it in the comments. The people arguing this out in journals were working from spreadsheets. Some of you were working from inside the hull, and that record is genuinely still being written. The third part of the reckoning is the one the American defense establishment likes least, and it is the strongest of the three because it does not rest on contested economics. It rests on a government report and a body count. In May of 2013, the United States Army Aeromedical Research Laboratory published a study on preventing injury in MRAP accidents. It examined 130 Army MRAP accidents between October of 2006 and June of 2009, involving 220 personnel, 95 of them injured, 9 of them killed. And here is the finding. All 9 fatalities came from rollovers. Of those 9, 5, which is 56%, were drownings. Men who died when their vehicle went into water and turned over. Rollovers were only 28% of the accidents in that data set. 100% of the deaths. Be precise about what that study is and is not, because this is exactly the sort of number that gets laundered. It is 130 Army accidents across a specific 32-month window. It is not the lifetime total of every MRAP rollover death in both wars. It is a bounded sample, and it is a primary Army source, and inside its own boundaries it is unambiguous. The Associated Press had found the outline of this a full 5 years earlier, through a Freedom of Information Act request. Between November of 2007 and June of 2008, at least 66 MRAP-related accidents, nearly 40 of them rollovers. The reporting also collected the small absurdities that come with putting a 9-foot-tall vehicle into places built for something else. Low-hanging Iraqi power lines snagging on hulls, rebar from destroyed buildings puncturing tires, and a warning from the Marine Corps Center for Lessons Learned that road shoulders in the region were not built to American standards and could simply collapse under the weight of the vehicle. The Corps put out a driver education newsletter that told men, in as many words, that this was not their father's Oldsmobile. On the 23rd of April 2008, that warning came true in Iraq. A 19-ton Cayman took a 90-degree turn at roughly 5 miles an hour. The shoulder of a canal gave way beneath it, and the vehicle slid backward into about 10 feet of water. The power failed. Inside a sealed armored box, in the dark, upside down, in water, 3 of the 4 men in the rear compartment found an air pocket and were pulled out through the roof turret. Private First Class John T. Bishop, whose gear caught as he tried to get out, and First Lieutenant Timothy W. Cunningham, who had been thrown to the back and was not wearing his seatbelt, both of the 101st Airborne, did not get out. 2 months later, 3 Green Berets drowned when their RG-31 rolled into a canal in southern Afghanistan. The same 3 design choices that beat the bomb, the high hull, the height off the ground, the mass, are the 3 choices that put those men in the water. That is not irony. That is engineering. Every protective decision is a trade, and this trade was made in a period when the buried bomb was killing 3 out of 4 casualties, and then the canal was not killing anyone yet. The Army study noted that electronic stability control, the technology that civilian data credits with 70 to 90% fewer fatal rollovers, was at that point available only on one light variant and merely planned for another. The fix existed. It was not in the fleet. And then there is the delay, which is the part of this story where the failure is not physics but paperwork. In February of 2005, more than 2 years before Gates made MRAP the department's top priority, a Marine urgent request went forward for 1,169 mine-resistant vehicles, signed by then Brigadier General Dennis Heglich, stating there was an immediate need for this capability. In June of that year, Commandant General Michael Hagee decided instead that the up-armored Humvee was the best available and most survivable option. The urgent request was effectively abandoned. The Department of Defense Inspector General, in a report released in December of 2008, confirmed that chronology and stated that the up-armored Humvee did not adequately protect Marines from underbody attacks. A Marine Corps science advisor named Franz Gale went public in January of 2008, alleging gross mismanagement, and argued the roughly 19-month delay had cost hundreds of lives. What happened to him afterward is part of the record too. He was reprimanded, suspended, criminally investigated, and stripped of part of his security clearance and did not reach a settlement through the Office of Special Counsel until September of 2014. The Marine Corps Warfighting Laboratory produced a 355-page study disputing his framing, arguing the Corps had not sat on MRAP requests. Be careful here, and be fair. The Inspector General confirmed the request was made, mishandled, and dropped. It did not find criminal negligence. Gale's estimate of the human cost of the delay is an estimate, and an interested one, and the counter-study is real. What is not in dispute is the sequence. The requirement was identified in 2005. The crash program started in 2007. Men drove Humvees through that gap. So where does this vehicle actually rank? 3 things decide it. The first is that the concept was correct, and the evidence for that is not the contested 40,000. It is Anbar in 2007, where a field commander with 100 vehicles could show fewer than 1 injury per attack against more than 2 casualties per attack in everything else, and immediately asked for 3,000 more. Commanders do not beg for equipment that is not working. The Rolfs and Sullivan critique is a serious argument about marginal cost-effectiveness at the high end of the armor curve. It is not, and never claimed to be, an argument that the V-hull does not defeat an underbelly blast. It does. That physics is settled. The second is that the price was real and mostly unavoidable, which is a different thing from saying it was well spent. Call it $45 to $47.7 billion, depending on whether you count procurement alone or all appropriations through fiscal year 12. Roughly 24,000 vehicles fielded out of nearly 28,000 built, from a worldwide fleet of about 25,500. But here's the figure that tells you what emergency really costs. A bare production MRAP ran somewhere between $535,000 and $600,000. The average field cost per vehicle, once you include spares and upgrades and everything else, came to about $1.29 million. You did not pay twice the sticker because someone was stealing. You paid it because you skipped the queue. The Government Accountability Office found that testing and fielding overlapped heavily, with orders for thousands of vehicles placed before operational testing was complete and nearly 12,000 vehicles under contract as of March 2008, before operational effectiveness had been determined. That is how you get a vehicle in 18 months. It is also how you get pneumatic doors nobody stress tested against a blast. The third is the one that should sit heaviest. The RAP's real American failure was not the concept, and not even the cost. It was time. The V-hull was a 1970s solution. The Caspier was in service before most of the men who died in Humvees were born. The requirement was written down in 2005 and shelved. And when the program finally moved, it moved so fast that safety features already standard on civilian trucks like stability control arrived in the fleet after men had already drowned in canals. The Pentagon did not fail to invent something. It failed to notice in time that somebody else already had. Which brings the story to a strange, unsatisfying ending, because the vehicle outlived its war and had nowhere to go. The Pentagon eventually determined it had no future use for roughly 12,300 of its 25,500 MRAPs. Shipping them home from Afghanistan cost more than they were worth, so around 2,000 of the 11,000 in country were declared excess and destroyed where they stood, each one taking something like 12 hours of blowtorch work to reduce to scrap, then sold by weight to local vendors. About 150 went to Croatia. In total, more than $7 billion of American equipment was destroyed in place rather than brought back. Every shredded hull represented roughly $1 million of original outlay, turned into a pile of metal by a man with a torch. The ones that came home went somewhere else. Through the Department of Defense's 1033 program, which since the late 1990s has transferred surplus military equipment to domestic law enforcement, MRAPs began appearing in American police departments. In August of 2014, when protests followed the police killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, television audiences saw mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles on a suburban American street, and the MRAP became the visual shorthand for a national argument about police militarization. By that summer, Missouri agencies alone had acquired at least 20 mine-resistant vehicles through the program. President Obama restricted certain transfers by executive order in 2015. Those restrictions were lifted in 2017. Reporting afterward found that training time for officers to operate these vehicles ranged from 20 hours down, in some cases, to about 15 minutes. That is a policy argument, and it belongs in a different conversation than this one. Whether an MRAP protected a squad in Helmand, and whether an MRAP belongs outside a courthouse in Missouri, are two entirely separate questions, and collapsing them tells you nothing useful about either. But it is part of what this vehicle became, and leaving it out would be its own kind of dishonesty. Go back to that sealed door in Iraq, the 14th bomb, the man alive inside the machine that would not let him out. That is not a story about a failure. It is a story about what happens when you solve one problem so hard, so fast, and so late that you have no time left to solve the next one. The hull held. The doors did not. The men in Anbar got their vehicles and the men in the canal got them too. The 40,000 is a Pentagon estimate the Pentagon will not show its work for. And the boondoggle is an economist's argument about the margin, and the truth is almost certainly somewhere in the uncomfortable middle where both sides have to give something up. The MRAP is not the most impressive vehicle America built in those wars. It is the most honest one. It is what a country looks like when it finally admits it got the last war's assumptions wrong and starts writing checks to fix it. 2 years too late, at 3 times the price, with a design it borrowed from somebody else. That is not a triumph, and it is not a scandal. It is what emergency engineering actually costs, and the bill comes with names on it. So, where do you put it? A miracle that arrived late, or a $47 billion overcorrection that a smarter military would never have needed? Make the case in the comments, and if you have a number I have not seen, bring the source with it. Subscribe to Combat Proven. The next system is already in the queue.